Let me turn to staffing because, as I mentioned earlier, it's been one of my concerns, personal concerns about the way we staff our technology projects and whether, and not being a technology person, I'm a fish out of water when it comes to most of this stuff, but we tend to utilize people inside that are embedded inside departments and agencies as IT specialists who are sort of running these projects. And so every agency that has a different IT project has different people. We're not using the same people across the board to work on projects in various agencies for continuity purposes. So in looking at your report, I noticed there was a comment, lack of experience is magnified in small agencies that may never have conducted an IT project or do so rarely. Another comment I noted from your report also recognizes the value of a more central approach to develop a core strength in complex IT procurement management in order to capitalize on economies of scale, boost institutional knowledge, and lend support to smaller, inexperienced agencies. That caused me, when I read this, to think, well, would it be better for us to centralize our information technology personnel, both in terms of designing specifications and projects and handling procurement in one agency as a question? And in your review of other states' best practices, how do other states handle that? Is that a fair question,
well,
Doctor?
I'll let my colleague here speak to the how other states handle it. I'll explain why, in particular, we thought this was very important to centralize this kind of, these kinds of skills and capacity. These projects are major projects. They're multi-million dollar projects. An agency takes that on once every couple of decades, maybe once every decade, and that's a short turnaround. You have staff there that will live through that implementation. They'll acquire all sorts of skills in implementing a system of this magnitude. Next time that agency goes through that process, those staff are probably retired, and that skill set is gone. And these are not skills that you acquire, in sort of doing your day job, and then you do these sort of, on the side. This is something where you have to really train people to understand how to do this kind of requirements elicitation, there's a whole host of skills that are needed to be able to implement an IT system, whether it be on the technical side or the process side. And what we found was that agencies were trying to find their best and brightest and deploy them on these projects. Those skills, the skills that the best and brightest have in the finance area or accounting or whatever they're doing, aren't necessarily going to translate to an IT implementation. And so we really focused on trying to get that kind of capacity developed centrally and then farmed out to agencies as needed. We looked at the OSI model, which we thought was very good, and suggested that model be extended and placed somewhere central. The sort of natural place for that to be was in the Department of Technology, which was then CTA. It seemed like that would be the sort of the natural home for it. And so that was the thinking behind this recommendation. And I'll let you speak to the state.
I think California should actually be proud of that OSI model. We looked at it. Richard Pennington, I know one of the fellow members of the task force, was writing a book on best practices and actually highlighted that in his book. It's a good model, and it's worked well, and it's had successful implementations. Using that model, a state agency would essentially use that group to help it deliver its contract. So where you have the funding of the projects coming through the agency and you have the business owners engaged at the agency level, having the OSI group operating out of the California Technology Authority would give them the skilled professionals. And we presume there'd be an integrated team in there with the procurement people, with the attorneys necessary, and with the business people and the project managers to effectively deliver a major IT project. The other thing we said in the report was that there may be circumstances where an agency might qualify with their own staff. But we put kind of a gatekeeping rule on the California Technology Authority to do staff review and staff analysis as a part of the planning process. Do you have the capable staff to do this? This is what you need. And if they don't, they could then, in theory, shift them over this way. Many of these recommendations kind of fit together. To get to your question about what are other states doing, there's a variety of centralized and decentralized models. States like Utah, states like Michigan have a very centralized model. Tennessee has moved to a very centralized model, but it's for all information technology. Now that's beyond the scope of this report, and we weren't looking at the structure of information technology, and we didn't comment on that. But we did think, with respect to procurement, there is a way through this model that Rocio has talked about to actually give you the ability of a central model without centralizing the whole thing, expecting those agencies, unless they have the skills and the capacity, to use this central model to help them deliver their project. That allows you to invest the kind of training and skills in these teams that have the competency and capability and the scale to actually handle these projects.
And OSI is the Office of Systems Integration. It's my understanding it's in the Health and Human Services.
That's correct.
Can you be a little bit more specific as to how that actually operates? That was sort of news to me, but very interesting news.
So it actually in this area, and I may not have this precisely right because I'm not an expert in how you're structured in California, but you have a number of different health agencies. So when they have a project, an information technology project to acquire, it goes through the Office of System Integration. And there they have the project management team, they have the procurement team. They really put the integrated team together that oversees the acquisition and delivery of the project. And one of the important things that they saw that other states that tend to not do well at is they've broken down silos between the function of information technology management and project management and the procurement. Some states will take a procurement project or a project where they want a new IT system, and they'll put the plan together and they'll think they want all this, and then they'll send it over to procurement. Procurement will say, well, we'll put an RFP on top of this and we'll put it out to bid, and they're not communicating particularly well. Now, I don't think you're going to have that problem here because you've really connected procurement with information technology and the California Technology Authority. But OSI had done that several years ago, and they've had pretty good outcomes.
So when, for example, there's resistance to re-engineering that we spoke about at the beginning of the hearing, the Office of Systems Integration or some other similar entity would push back and say, hey, you need to take a look at your processes, because if we try to do this using legacy functionality, we're going to be modifying the heck out of this thing.
Right. Yeah.
Numerous change orders and a lot of extra money.
Right.
And that revised FSR process would be part of what initiates that dialogue and discussion.
Now, there was a quote I picked up on in your report. I think this was from the report. It's important to have the state agency retain ownership for the business aspects of the project to prevent it from abdicating its responsibilities for the IT project.
That's right.
That's important because you want them to have ownership. You want them to be real partners in this. And also the agency fundamentally owns the business. They understand the business practices better than the OSI or any other agency that would come in and function in that capacity. So it's really important to maintain a strong tie ownership. Basically, the agency has to have real skin in the game to make sure that this succeeds.
If I might follow up on that, Mr. Chairman, the agency really needs to understand its business process, its business objectives, and what success looks like for this project. Forget for a minute the technology. What is it that they want to accomplish? They have to understand that and own that. And they have to be an equal partner in this deal to make sure that it's getting what they need at the end. They need to, as well, hold OSI accountable. But if they're not involved with that, what can happen is they'll OSI will give them a solution, and the agency will say, well, gosh, we thought that's not what we wanted. Well, they have to be part of that team.
When they say that's not what we wanted, now we have delays and we have change orders and we have extra money.
That's right.
Your recommendations 7 and 8 go to developing a cadre and a formal training plan. One of the issues in one of the recent procurement projects that we took a look at in this committee had there were staffing issues, if not periodically, consistently identified throughout the project. And you proposed the requirement for a formal staffing plan as part of the project approval basis. I gather that's to address
The switching out, the swapping out. When the vendor comes in, we heard from both sides on this. Actually, we heard vendors saying we heard state staff saying we want vendors to put their A team out and keep their A team there the whole time, because many times what happens is because of the lengthy procurement process, a vendor puts a proposal forward, puts an A team together, or A minus team, puts that together, puts it out. The state has to go through its process to issue an award and so on, and by the time the project actually begins, a sufficient amount of time has gone by that A team is no longer available. So they bring in other staff. Or throughout the project, they switch staff out. And this was, part of the reason that this vendor was awarded that the contract was because of the quality and the caliber of the staff that they were bringing to the project. And so that's what we heard from from the state staff, but we also heard from vendors that they felt that they weren't getting the A team from the state. And so it made their job much more difficult. And I can repeat the same thing I said about the vendors, same thing I said about the state. And so what we suggest here, or we recommend here, is a formal staffing plan on the part of the state agency that's putting this forward. Again, looking at what state staff will be on the project, that they are released from their current duties and they're not doing this as sort of their second full-time job. And that the vendor also propose staff that they will have on the project, and then there's a whole host of checks and balances that go on afterwards if, in fact, that staff gets changed out later on.
So it sounds like the centralization of IT staffing on the state side might address the problem with state employees who are given this project as an additional duty. And they probably won't be if it's centralized in some sort of IT, whether it's the OSI or some other operation. On the vendor side, I guess your suggestion is that our procurement process be tightened up to make sure that the vendors supply us with the staffing model, the people, the qualifications that are going to be used to staff our project, and substitutions are allowed, but the substitutions have to meet the minimum, at least the same qualifications or higher as the people that were submitted when we approved the bid.
Yeah, on that note, Mr. Chairman, when it comes to formal staffing, and you get these guys that are on these projects for 5-10 years, how do you keep the continuity in with the programs? How do you keep these guys on, or is there a silver bullet here, or are we just by gosh and by golly, and you just deal with it as it comes up, and you get.
Are you talking about the on the state side or on the vendor side?
On the state side.
As I mentioned earlier, these projects happen once every decade, and so I think
This one's long-term employment here all of a sudden, though.
Right. The model we're proposing to have that the Chairman Roth is referring to, this more centralized, whether it be these OSI, but to have a central repository of staff who have the skills to be able to carry out a major IT project. If we have those, and as people, we have people come in, they're trained. The state would have people come in and they would be trained. As people move out, you move on to other careers to do other thing in their career. You would continually replenish that core body of knowledge and in staff that you have in this central location.
You'd have a bench.
Yeah,
That's-
depth in the bench, absolutely.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't necessarily have that problem that you're referring to.
And you might have to pay them appropriately as well.
You absolutely would.
Mr. Chair, the other reason that this question is in there, that assessment of the staffing plan, is because that agency who only replaces a system every 10 years really doesn't have a good idea of what it will take. And so this makes sure that they come to understand that. And in that model where it would be executed in a decentralized model, that is a problem because they don't have any bench strength, as Senator Berryhill mentioned. Single agency doing a project every now and then, maybe they've got somebody on board that can handle this okay, but when they leave, then they have to manage that. It's harder.
You, in your report, you talk about contingency contract dollar amounts, which I assume is managing expectations of those looking in from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
What's a success and what's a failure? Trying to set that standard ahead of time, whether it's in terms of length of contract term, time for performance, or dollar amounts expended. Could you be a little more specific on that?
Mr. Chair, you read that exactly right, I think. The difficulty as we saw this was that it was almost an unwritten rule, or maybe it was a written rule, that the contingency was 10%. And they did everything in their power to stay under the 10%. And that might be appropriate for some things, but a one-size-fits-all solution isn't going to be appropriate for a number of things. And so we looked at this model and we looked at what happened in construction. And sometimes there would be a construction or remodel project that, because they had done the kind of estimating and analysis up front that might understand that they needed a bigger contingency, it should be justifiable. They should have a pretty good basis of understanding of what that contingency needs to be. But for that kind of project, it ought to be set at the right level. And the project executive ought to be the one who approves that contingency. Because some of these projects are complicated and will have a number of unforeseen circumstances that are going to have to be addressed in it. And what we found was that sometimes people were making all the wrong decisions just because of that arbitrary 10% number. And we wanted them to be making the right decisions for the right reasons.
Right, or perhaps there's been an absence of accountability, and it doesn't really matter. You can set the contingency at 10%, but if it jumps to 30, then so be it. That's not a question. That's just a comment on my part. Your recommendation number 10 has to do with the Department of Technology, as I recall, in studying and annually reporting on what you earlier referred to as alternative contracting vehicles. And you mentioned earlier the modular approach, block by block. During your task force study and your review of our California operation, were you able to determine whether the modular approach is utilized in California IT procurement?
Mr. Chairman, I don't think I can't say that it's not being utilized somewhere, but I don't think we saw any examples of a modular procurement approach. I think the concept we discussed, I think there was general agreement. It may have been used at some smaller levels, but not for major projects. The Fiscal project was one that was probably as close to an alternate of a major IT project, as close to an alternate procurement that we saw in the way that they began to communicate and had broad and effective communication to develop the solution before they made the award. And we saw that as a step in the right direction, but that's completely different than the modular procurement.
And maybe you mentioned this earlier, but other than the modular approach, are there other alternative contracting methods that you suggest we consider?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Appendix E at the back of the report had a list of some that we suggested that should be looked at. I think the point here, is when you know what your requirements are, when you got a sense of what the market is, before you develop your procurement strategy, you really ought to be taking a look at the best practices for what that acquisition model ought to be. Because if you select the wrong acquisition model, it could be very hard to get the kind of outcome you need from the kind of project you need. In some cases, you know exactly what you need, And so you can go with a pretty basic model. But in other cases, you may be asking the vendor to come in and develop solutions to things that have not been identified, and you don't really know how it needs to be. Well, you need to have a dialogue with them, and you need to have a different process. So we've identified some, like an incremental approach, which would allow you to have phases of contracts, where you do the first phase and you could award a second phase and another phase. We've also identified best value models on an Appendix C. I think the performance information procurement system used by Arizona State is an interesting model in use of best value, because it goes through a series of filters without having to go into a very long and drawn out proposal that takes a lot of time and effort. In the end, it has the contractor who's selected really proposing the solution set, but it has some drawbacks in my view as well, because at the end you're just with one contractor. You don't have two to negotiate against, and so that's a weakness. But I think the right model for the procurement depends on what you're trying to buy. How you're going to buy cloud services, particularly if it's public cloud service, is a different model than how you would buy a system integration using COTS software. And so you really need to understand what the need is, and then look at this inventory of different procurement models, and don't be afraid to modify one that you think is going to work best for you.
Now, in your in your review and your deliberations and discussion, did anyone in California identify statutory impediments to this sort of alternative contracting method? I mean, I assume there's no statutory impediment to the modular approach, because that's just a series of small contracts that hopefully integrate into a larger project that works.
Mr. Chairman, I asked that question specifically, and I did not get the sense that there was any statutory impediment that people saw directly. And I asked that because I've been involved in rewriting procurement statute in 2 states, where we put in a clause for, as we call it, special procurements for information technology, because we knew that some of the requirements for competitive sealed proposal or competitive sealed bid, at least in Alaska, created difficulty when you're trying to actually develop a contract for information technology. And so we changed that in Alaska, we changed that in Oregon. It's since been adopted in the Model Procurement Code. And what it does, it allows a state to have a determination of its chief procurement official that there are circumstances in which the competitive sealed bid, competitive sealed proposals would not apply, and you could actually craft a procurement process that was designed to achieve the outcome that you needed. As written in Model Procurement Code in these states, has to be competitive, so it can't just be one individual, and it has to have an appeal process. Right. But it allows the ability to develop something that meets the need. Now, I didn't hear from any of the folks that we talked to in DGS or at California Technology Authority that they saw a statutory impediment to doing any of these things that we had proposed and talked about.
Just to switch gears for a second, earlier you mentioned the library of, sort of a library of vendors, I think, or projects, and in the report you also talk about a library of standard procurement language.
Yes.
I guess if procurement is centralized, that's less important than if all the departments and agencies continue to play in the sandbox. But did you see any statutory impediments to either of those, either the inventory of vendors and vendor performance or the library of procurement provisions?
Did not, because the library, in one sense, you've got a library of provisions that are kind of the terms and conditions that would go into those, and it's important to recognize that one size doesn't fit all. The kinds of information technology terms and conditions you need for buying out of the cloud are different than getting a system integrator contract, and they're different than buying software. So those have got to be developed and inventoried, if you will, and you have a library of those. And as well, the acquisition models should be, and we talk about reporting on those and evaluating those, but those should be put into that library so people can use them again, and they can modify them, and they can learn from what worked and what didn't work last time.
Now, in your recommendation number 12, you talk about the technology department, or I guess you refer to it as the procurement authority, conducting a post-project evaluation, lessons learned, needed improvements. In reviewing our IT landscape in California and in speaking with the technology agency at the time and the agency's representatives, did you encounter or learn of any statutory or regulatory impediments to the agency conducting such a post-project review?
Our recommendation, Mr. Chair, was that would be an administrative manual change, so we did not see a statutory impediment to that.
Is that utilized in other states to effect? That's a fair question of you.
It is. I can tell you that in Oregon we used a lessons learned process that we tried to share, but you can't ensure that everybody reads it, and you can't ensure that everybody learns from that. And I can't tell you beyond that who's doing lessons learned.
When we run out of money, we'll learn in California, right? One of the recommendations, I think it was 13, and you talk about, I thought this was interesting, the qualitative versus quantitative analysis of proposals. And I guess part of the qualitative or subjective analysis could be, how well you performed some other project, how satisfied your former customer or client was, how responsive you were to requests of your the contracting agency to change, et cetera. What difficulties do you see in implementing the qualitative versus the quantitative analysis in California?
Mr. Chairman, the difficulty, I think, is likely to be protests of the award. As soon as, in that, anytime you've got a big award, there's a lot of money on the table, and particularly in a contentious environment where communication may not have been as good as it could have been, you're going to have somebody lodge a protest, and they will look at the evaluation criteria to see if that was carried out, and did this award consistent with that evaluation criteria. And then they'll look at it if it was okay there. Then they'll look at it to see if the evaluation criteria would hold water. And so that's oftentimes the target of a protest, because that's one of the few things that a protest has to go on, as long as everything else has been done appropriately in accordance with the RFP.
Again, I'm not sure that you can answer this, but do other states utilize the qualitative approach to bid evaluation coupled with the more objective quantitative?
Yes, other states do use qualitative approach. There's a continuum here. Some states are not much beyond the invitation to bid process, which is using here are the specifications. We'll use an RFP to score it. Money, the cost is such a percentage, and we'll have this criteria that is very objective, and you have to be fully compliant with it, or what's termed responsive to the bid. And if you're not responsive, you're rejected. Other states have a more, I would say, flexible approach, which would allow there to be discussions on the RFP and the ability to clarify that. And so you get that kind of range, and that would allow those states that allow more flexibility typically would be the ones that you would find where they would have qualitative evaluation.
And more protests?
Protests are interesting because we didn't have a lot of protests in Oregon, but
maybe it's a cultural thing.
I think to some degree it can be cultural. I think there's something to be said for the value of the contract. Sometimes, if it's high enough, there's a likelihood that people can't afford, particularly if they've invested a year and a half in developing the proposal, to let that go without at least looking at it.
Earlier, in response to Senator Berryhill's, one of Senator Berryhill's questions, you touched on the subject of vendor management and contract management. And as I recall in your report, I think it was 16, your recommendation, you recommend the establishment of I gather it's a centralized contract management office for these large IT projects. Could you touch on that for me? And how would that look and how would it work? And
So, Mr. Chairman, this is really the same as recommendation number 6. We talked about this OSI type unit that would actually be managing the project. Well, they would also be the ones managing the project as it moved through the procurement process. That unit would also be responsible for overseeing the completion of the project and the compliance of the project. So they should be holding the project the contractor's team, accountable for delivery of that project, and they're really doing contract compliance work as a part of what they would do.
I see. I was intrigued by your comments regarding the use of incentive provisions. I think was it recommendation 17?
Yes.
In other words, I gather you'd put the onus on the contractor, at least in part, to turn in a good performance in exchange for some additional financial reward.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. You know, within the procurement community, probably one of the best examples or most widely talked about examples of effective incentive contracts was with California Transportation Authority after the Loma Prieta, I believe, earthquake, where they built an overpass in really record time. And they used an incentive model to do that. In fact, I signed an exemption while I was the chief procurement official in Oregon for our Department of Transportation to do an overpass on a major corridor. And the basis of that was that the cost associated with the bonus, if you will, was a tremendous savings if we could get the project done that much quicker, because the cost of the public being inconvenienced by having this overpass take a year to build rather than 6 months to build far exceeded any bonus that the contractor was going to get. So our Department of Transportation used that model, and they had great success with it. So when we have complex IT projects where time is always critical and successful outcomes are very important, why aren't we using incentive contracts to try and get the contractor aligned with that kind of success that we need? And what's wrong with them getting done earlier instead of late?
So your suggestion is to treat it much like a freeway rehab or construction project, so it's really time and money. So it's a time-based analysis. If you bring the project in under schedule in terms of time, you get extra money, and that's really the calculus.
That's correct.
Now, your report talks about unilateral judgment and sole discretion, and that would seem to be difficult to manage and difficult to incentivize a contractor if the state has discretion as to whether to pay the money. If I understood it right.
So, Mr. Chairman, there are risks associated with incentive contracts, and you have to be very careful in how they're going to be accounted for, when is the incentive triggered, and who's in control of that contract. So this in a few paragraphs is not going to give you the prescription for the right IT incentive contract, but we think this should actually be able to apply and work in information technology, but it will take some planning and some due diligence and some careful construction of the procurement vehicle and the contract document to make sure that it's administered in a way that the state's happy with the outcome.
And I gather this is not unheard of in the IT area, these incentive contracts, or are we blazing new ground with respect to contract language?
It's not unheard of in the private side. I don't know of, Rocio may know
no,
of some.
this is not this is common practice in the world of IT.
Common practice.
Yes.
So language and contract vehicles and the like are available for review in terms of we're not trying to invent something new here and
Correct.
designing a system.
Correct.
I assume you may or may not know this, I assume this may require some change to our public contract code to permit this sort of contracting?
That was our belief, Mr. Chair. And in fact, we talked a little bit about this, and if my understanding, my memory serves me correctly, I think they had actually looked at it and understood that they needed to make statutory change.
The last series of recommendations I think you've addressed have to do with communication, and certainly communication is important, and sometimes we have it and sometimes we don't, and when we don't, we have problems. Have I failed to cover any aspect of your, what I certainly consider to be an excellent and outstanding task force report? Have I missed anything in terms of your substantive or procedural recommendations?
No, I think you covered them all pretty
believe so.
much.